Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Wellness for All webinar. And today we'll be looking at the area of leadership for the 21st century. Over the course of this year, we've been trying to focus more on the work environment and the job-related domains in our Wellness Charter. If you remember, we did a session with the CIWM. We had looked at compassionate leadership, and more recently, we had some of our Suez experts join us and share their career stories with us. Today, we're going to be looking at a different area of leadership. We'll hear about a new approach to leadership that was created in and for the 21st century. It's simple and memorable and may just change the way you work. We'll be invited to think differently about leadership, and we'll hear about something called primary colours. We'll also hear about incomplete leadership. So who's going to be sharing their expert knowledge with us today? Well, I'm pleased to introduce David Pendleton. David is a professor in leadership at Henley Business School and a member of the Henley Centre for Leadership. He co-founded the Edgecombe Consulting Group in 1995, where he's worked with a range of clients from the airline, hospitality, pharmaceuticals, retail, healthcare, and the professional and financial services sector across Europe, Asia, and America. He's the holder of an Oxford doctorate in psychology and a chartered psychologist and associate fellow of the Said Business School at Oxford University. He's an honorary fellow of the Royal College of General Practitioners and a member of the trustee board. I met David quite recently when we were both speaking, just by coincidence, at an international conference. And I was so impressed with what he was saying and how he came across and what he was sharing. I asked him to join us here at Suez for one of our webinars. So thank you very much, David, for agreeing to do that for us.
Pleasure, pleasure. So is that my cue to start?
It is. Over to you.
Perfect. Well, good morning, everyone. It's been a pleasure so far. I only know 3 people who work at Suez so far, but they've all been utterly charming and smart as can be. So I'm absolutely delighted, although I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit, if I may, about an approach to leadership that I put together in and for the 21st century, as Tracy said. And that's simply because when I came into the field of leadership about 20 years ago, what I discovered, having looked back over the literature of the 20th century and looked at the way not only had leadership been written about, but also researched, what I could see was that it was kind of all over the place as a discipline. It was more subject to fads and fashions than it was to the kind of inexorable march of science. You couldn't see any fundamental principles that leadership was always about, and it was hard to see the kind of basic steps to which you could return if you were in doubt as to what to do as a leader. So what I decided to do was to try to kind of reimagine the discipline, not by asking the way people should lead, but asking really, first of all, what is leadership about and what is it that leaders have to do? And the first conclusion I came to, in a sense, is the nature of leadership. I'm rather intrigued that today I'm speaking under the guise of a series to do with wellness for all. And yet that is exactly right for the field of leadership. I want to contend, first of all, that leadership is about getting the preconditions right. The preconditions for what? Well, the preconditions, of course, for performance and for success, but even more fundamentally, the preconditions for people, human beings, to thrive. So wellness is not a bad umbrella term to be thinking about when you're also thinking about leadership. But what I want to suggest to you is that I think there are 4 propositions that will be helpful to you. And I'll start by saying my aims, which is when putting this approach together, I wanted, first of all, for all of this to be based on decent evidence. As I said, the field of leadership has been characterized more by fads and fashions than it really should have been. And I wanted it to be based upon evidence that was kind of reproducible and therefore likely to be much more solid and well-founded. I wanted it to be reflective of the 21st century's society and needs, and that's simply because throughout the 20th century, what I could see is that leadership moved on as the mores of society moved on. So at the beginning of the 20th century, leadership was all about how to be a responsible but authoritarian boss, and by the end of the 20th century, leadership was much more about partnership and shared leadership. In a sense, this process is what I've written about and described as the democratization of leadership. And in some senses also, it's a slightly more feminized version of leadership than you'd have found 100 years ago. But more than all of that, I wanted the ideas that I put together to be coherent, they fit together well, simple and memorable. And the reason for those last three, coherent, simple and memorable, is not because people aren't smart. Not that you folks are not smart, it's that you folks are busy. And if the ideas about leadership I'm going to describe are going to be useful to you, you need to have them front of mind rather than so far in the back of your mind that you've got to go and look them up every time you want to apply them. So you'll be the best judge as to whether or not that's been achieved, but I'm trying to make the ideas that I'm going to share with you coherent, simple, and memorable. In fact, one of the nicest compliments that was paid about this approach was paid by a guy who quoted Oliver Wendell Holmes, who had said that he would give nothing for the simplicity on this side of complexity, but he'd give everything for the simplicity on the far side of complexity, having taken all the complexity into account, but made things simple again. And that the kind thing he said was that he thought that these ideas were of that kind. So you'll be the best judge as to whether that's an accurate description, but I'll launch into them now. I suggested there were 4 propositions. I'm going to start with the first. The first proposition I have for you is that this model defines the territory of leadership. By that, I mean, you can regard this as a kind of a map of the territory. It's a Venn diagram, as you can see. I've called it the primary colors model because I've described it as a bit like the primary colors of light, that if you can get all 3 in perfect balance, then you'll get perfect white light with all of the colors contained within it. But I'd suggest to you that leadership is really about occupying effectively 3 domains: the strategic domain, the operational domain, and the interpersonal domain. The strategic domain is all about tomorrow. So there are very few facts in the strategic domain. There's the world of possibilities, and we're only limited by our imaginations there. But there are very few facts because although the rules of physics are not going to change and the sun is still likely to rise in the same portion of the sky, but what we do know is that all of the variables we'd like to have the most information about, exchange rates, even weather, what's going to happen, will there be a new pandemic, will there be a new strain of the coronavirus? We don't know any of that. The strategic domain is largely dealing with uncertainty, but it is dealing with it in such a way that the best way of creating any kind of control in the strategic domain is not to try to predict it, but to try to create it. The operational domain is almost the exact reverse. The operational domain is all about today, but it's also full of facts. In fact, there's a huge amount of complexity in the operational domain. Think of the world of targets and budgets and goals, and think about all the plans and the Gantt charts and all of the projects that we have to deliver and so on. And the pure case in the operational domain is about delivering results. I'm afraid every day that has to be done. And it's different again from the interpersonal domain, in which the pure case is about building and sustaining relationships. But between those 3 domains, there are 3 bridging tasks to be done. The bridge between this vague sense of direction, which I've called setting strategic direction, and by the way, it is likely to be vague until it gets encapsulated into something much more specific. But the bridge is the notion of planning and organizing. So we can start with a very broad sense of purpose and vision, but it's got to get translated by a series of plans which cascade down into more and more specific plans to a form in which we can then actually deliver the results that are required. So we may start with purpose and vision. That will allow us at some point to put together a very broad organizational strategy. That will get translated into an annual business plan, and then monthly, weekly, even daily sets of tasks that we need to deliver on. That's the bridge between setting direction and delivering results. We're calling it planning and organizing. On the people side of the diagram, on the east side of it, the bridge between that vague sense of direction and the relationships with our people is what I've called creating alignment. The task there is to make sure that people come with us on the journey, that they feel valued, that they know what their place is in all of it, that they know how best to contribute, and that they feel enthusiastic about and committed to the goals that we're setting for our organization. And the bridge between the relationships with our people and the delivery of results is what I've called teamworking. Teamworking, when it works best, as you'll all know very well, is when a small team can look like a big team because of its synergistic working, that we somehow so help each other, so support each other, that small teams can have the same impact as larger teams, simply because we're bringing out the best in each other. Or, of course, you'll know very well that the opposite can happen, and we can get in each other's way, trip each other up, be more hindering than helping. And even a big team looks like the effectiveness of a small team because the team working is not working well. And what I've called leading in the middle is not double counting, nor is it the total of everything else. There are two very specific tasks to what I've called leading. First, it's about choosing which of those other leadership tasks are relevant at any given time. So you can't work on them all simultaneously. The question is, what are we focusing on right now? And the second is sustaining effort, because there may well be a time in which you've got to keep plugging away at exactly the same task for an awfully long time until it's properly done. And sustaining the effort, like Shakespeare's Henry V, so that people will go once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, is the consequence of having chosen the right task, made the right case, built the right alignment. Then people can be sustained in their efforts to continue plugging away at the same task until it's done and done right. Now, I said that setting strategic direction can be quite vague, and let me give you a real example of that. My friend Tony Tyler, who had been chief executive of Cathay Pacific Airways in Hong Kong, went to become Director General of IATA, the International Air Transport Association, based in Geneva and in Montreal, and that they're in 140 countries around the world. He came to IATA and looked at it for a while, having been a chief exec of an airline, and he brought together in a big strategy conference his top 300 executives from all over the world. And he said this: look, folks, the world's airlines are safe and secure, otherwise people wouldn't fly. The problem is that they're not sustainable. That is, the whole airline business can flip from profit to loss at the drop of a hat from one year to the next. And he even cited the example of the first year of the first Gulf War, in which the world's airlines collectively lost more money than had ever been made to that point in the history of aviation. So he said, here's the puzzle for IATA. The world's airlines are safe and secure, but not economically sustainable. So the task for IATA is to become a source of innovation and change in the airline industry towards much greater economic sustainability. And I was there at the time, and people came out of the conference saying, you know, that's so clear, that's crisp and beautifully formulated, an elegant encapsulation of what we've got to do at IATA. And then one bright bloke at the back of the room said, Tony, thank you very much for that. How are we going to do it? And Tony said, I don't know. In fact, he said, I have no bloody idea. And the reason is, he said, that's the task that we've got to solve together. That's the puzzle that we as a leadership team, as an extended leadership team, have got to answer. We've got to solve that puzzle. The how question is ours collectively to decide. Where we're going is clear, and I think you can all see why. I said I wanted something to be simple, coherent, and memorable. That's about as simple as I can make it, but if you want it more memorable, here's a simple way of thinking about it. The strategic domain is about direction. It's about thought and figuring out which way to go. The operational domain is about getting things done. And the interpersonal domain is about putting our hearts, not just our brains and our backs, into it. So if you like, we put our brains into it, our backs into it, and our hearts into it, and we may have complete leadership. And for those of you who think that the interpersonal domain may be almost a kind of optional extra, I want to tell you that the evidence I've looked at suggests that the interpersonal domain is absolutely fundamental to holding the other two in place. Let me give you just one example of one study that demonstrates this. This is a study of management teams in Israel. This particular pair of researchers looked at 77 top management teams in Israel, published it in the Journal of Occupational Organizational Psychology, which is definitely an insomnia cure for most of us. And they came up with this idea that if you were looking for teams that had a greater capacity to adapt to changes in the environment, in other words, this is what they call strategic adaptability. If you want to know what is it that leads to greater strategic adaptability, is it something essentially intellectual? No. They said teams that showed a genuine interest in and concern for each other's needs were more likely to create team members who wanted to innovate, who were prepared to learn and to seek new opportunities both to innovate and learn. And that's what led to the greater strategic adaptability. So in a sense, think of it this way. Teams that created safety by showing a genuine interest in and concern for each other's needs emboldened people to learn and take risks and to try to innovate, knowing that other people had their backs. And that's what led to greater strategic adaptability. So the interpersonal domain is anything other than an optional extra. It is fundamental to being on the right track, both operationally and strategically. It will sustain us. It will enable us. It will embolden us. It will encourage us. So there's my first proposition to you, which is that the primary colors model defines the territory of leadership and identifies 7 tasks. Each zone of that Venn diagram is a task that people need to achieve if they're in leadership positions, at least not necessarily to achieve on their own. And the answer to why that's the case, I'll go on to my second proposition to define. And it's simply this, that it's really hard to do all of it really well. That is, on your own. It's hard to be world-class in all areas. Now, there are all sorts of reasons why this is true. In the book that I've written about this stuff, I got my colleague from Reading University, Trish Riddell, who's professor of psychology and neuroscience, to write a section in this. And she wrote about how the brain works. When you're thinking strategically, your brain is accessing a different part of the cerebral cortex than when you're thinking operationally or interpersonally. But, and this is the important thing, when you're thinking in one of those modes and switching one particular part of the brain on, another part of the brain switches the other parts off. So in other words, you can only do one of these things at a time. Now that doesn't in itself prove that you can't do all of these things really well. You could just simply alternate between those 3 different zones of the brain. But the other thing we know about the brain is that it's easier to access that bit of the brain when you access it more frequently. So if you're a natural strategic thinker, you will access that part much more easily, much more quickly, much more frequently, and the synapses, the connections between the neurons, will grow closer together to make this a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. It's self-perpetuating. If you're a natural operational thinker, you'll find that the same thing is happening in that part of the brain, and similarly in the interpersonal domain. So the first thing I'd say is it's hard to be good at all of it, because over time we learn to switch on different bits of the brain and off other parts of the brain much more frequently. But here's a second bit of evidence I'd offer to you. I and my colleagues have assessed thousands of leaders between us from all over the world. We've never yet found one who's world-class in all aspects of leadership. I think that bears repetition. We've not yet found one who's world-class in all aspects of leadership. So it may be much more sensible to think about what can I be world-class at as a leader? Where can I become more than adequate? And where do I probably need to seek help and get others to look after things for me. Gallup in 2008 published a book called Strengths-Based Leadership, and this was a summary of literally decades of their research on leaders and leadership from all over the world. And I was struck by this summary comment at the end, that in their experience and in their research, the best leaders are not well-rounded, but the best teams are. Again, that bears repetition. The best leaders are not well-rounded, the best teams are. And that's why they said effective leaders surround themselves with the right people and build on each person's strengths. Along a similar line, Deborah Ancona at MIT said this in an article she published in the Harvard Business Review of 2007. She was talking about 4 different aspects of leadership, and she said, rarely will a single person be skilled in all areas. That's why it's critical that leaders find others who can offset their limitations and complement their strengths. Those who don't will not only bear the burden of leadership alone, but will find themselves at the helm of an unbalanced ship. So the idea here is that whilst we're unlikely to be equally skilled in all aspects of leadership, there is a solution. We can create complete leadership from incomplete leaders, but only if they can find others who can complement their strengths. Another study which supports that idea, and I'm emphasizing this simply because this is a key idea I want to bring to you this morning, is that we're unlikely to become well-rounded leaders on our own. This is a study, a 2013 study, but published a little while later in the Harvard Business Review of 2015. PwC looked at 700 executives across a variety of industries from all over the world, and they asked people about their bosses. They said, could you please rate your bosses on a number of different rating scales? And 2 in particular stood out to me. The first was, they said, how good is your boss at defining strategy and identifying vision? In other words, that's fundamentally in the strategic domain. In other words, they're asking, in my terms, how good are they in the strategic domain? And then secondly, how good are they at executing strategy and vision? How good are they, if you like, in the operational domain? And this was the table of results from their study. You'll see that it's only 8% were able to be good at both executing and developing strategy. So that's the strategic and the operational domain, only 8%. That's before you even add the interpersonal domain, which would be a subset of that 8%. So it's not impossible, but it's very, very unlikely that anyone's going to be good at all of it. Now, the highly numerate amongst you, and the keen-eyed, no doubt, will look at that table and say, well, wait a minute, those 2 things are correlated. If you see most of the data sits on that diagonal. Well, that's true, but that's because it's not difficult to be bad at both. You see that the biggest chunk of data is in the people who are neutral or worse at both. So whilst it's true that those 2 are correlated, it's not correlated because people can be good at both easily. It's because people can be bad at both easily. So clearly, this is further evidence, if more were needed, that it's really hard to be good at all of this on your own. Here's a deep thought for you. It comes from the Argentine. Apparently, there's an Argentine saying that the duck can walk, fly, and swim, but none of it very well. So I want to suggest to you that the takeaway message today might be: don't try to be a duck. There may be other things you could take away, but that's not a bad thing to remember. That can walk, fly, and swim. So what I'm saying is, if you're trying to develop yourself into the rounded leader, let me tell you that the evidence from the executive assessments that I and my colleagues have done suggest that what you're likely to be is moderately good at all of it, not world class at any of it. Now, having put this slide together, someone who knows about birds told me that apparently the duck is one of the avian world's best flyers. So I chose to ignore that completely, but you get the point. Okay, so I want to go on to my 3rd proposition, and that is you have to choose carefully what you're going to try to develop. Now, over time, we develop strengths and limitations, and you'll all have your own understanding of your own strengths and limitations that you've achieved over many years, maybe even in the case of some of you over decades of practice in your discipline. So strengths and limitations is only part of this diagram. I want you to think about how naturally those things sit with those attributes which are very hard to change, like your personality or your intelligence, and so on. Where you've developed a strength, where your personality is helping and which is consistent in a sense with your personality, that strength is going to feel very natural to you. I'll give you an example. So conscientiousness is a personality dimension. And planning and organizing is one of those leadership capabilities that I'm suggesting people may need to be able to develop. And if you're very good at planning and organizing, and if your personality is characterized by high levels of conscientiousness, then the ability to do the planning and organizing will feel like a very natural thing for you to do. You know, even hungover and on a bad day, the chances are you'll still put decent plans together. But it may be that you've got the attributes you need, but you haven't yet learned how to deploy them. So you've got a personality helping factor, but you still haven't yet developed a strength in that area. So although that's currently a limitation, I want to call that a potential strength. Think of the 7'2" athlete who hasn't yet discovered basketball. So they don't know about basketball at the moment, but boy, are they going to develop a strength pretty quickly because they've got all the attributes they need to take them there. That's a potential strength. Some of us, however, have spent a lot of time developing strengths in areas which we know are not really natural for us. We've been on our Prince 2 courses, we've been on our project management courses, we've been on our time management courses, and we've learned how to do all of that to a reasonable level of proficiency. But if we're highly curious and not terribly conscientious, we know that there's always the potential for our curiosity to get the better of us and for us to get distracted from putting our plans together, which leaves plans with holes in them. So we know that we've really got to focus in that area that I want to call now a fragile strength. Think of the example of learning a foreign language as an adult. And what you discover is that if you don't use it regularly, you will lose it. And it's easy, if you're not concentrating, to make errors simply because you're just not giving it your entire attention, whereas a native speaker wouldn't make those errors. So that's a fragile strength. But then there are things that I want to call resistant limitations. These are the areas that we might have been trying to get good at for years, but have not succeeded. And the chances are it's because not only have we got a limitation in that area, but we've got very little naturally that's helping us acquire strengths in that area. So I want to suggest to you that what we do with this matrix is this. We can work with our natural strengths and develop them to world class. We can work on our potential strengths. There's no reason why we couldn't, you know, the 7'2" athlete can learn basketball. That's not a problem. The fragile strengths, I'm afraid we've always got to work on because they're fragile. And in the case of the resistant limitation, we may need a different kind of solution, which I'm calling here the workaround solution. And what's the best workaround solution? Well, this is my third proposition that you can see. You have to choose carefully what to develop. What do I do in that area of workaround? Well, Gallup gave us a clue. Deborah Ancona gave us a clue. It's to find people with complementary differences. And what do I mean by that? It means finding people and putting them alongside us on our teams whose natural strengths sit in exactly the same area as our resistant limitations. That's a complementary teammate. Complement with an E, not an I. They're not praising us for being poor at something. But the natural strengths that sit in the area of our resistant limitations make the possibility that we can have complete leadership to a world-class standard, but only if we get incomplete leaders working well together. And may I say that, and it's terribly important that everyone understands this, that there's no weakness declared by adopting this philosophy. When BT Cellnet was floated out of British Telecom a number of years ago, it was under the leadership of a man called Peter Erskine, who became their first chief executive. Within 4 years, this dog of a mobile phone company that all the analysts said was going to fail almost instantly had been transformed by Peter Erskine into O2, the sexy, hip, young person's mobile phone company that had an exclusive license to use the iPhone. When the iPhone first came out in the UK, you could only get it on O2 because Apple fell in love with O2 as a company, and they gave 6 months of exclusive use to O2. And within 4 years, Erskine had not only done that, not only transformed it into one of the most sought after mobile phone networks, but he then sold it to Telefonica of Spain for 27 billion euros. This is a fantastic strategic success. And having worked with Peter for a while, actually at Oxford, he brought an awful lot of his leaders onto our executive leadership programs. He then came, when he'd sold it to Telefonica of Spain, came back to Oxford, and he said this. He said, "I am no strategic thinker." And everyone started to almost kind of heckle in the room at the time. "Come off it, that can't be true. Look at what you've just done." He said, "No, I'm really not." He said, "I'm an operational guy." So the first person I hired to put in the next door office to me was an outstanding strategy director. So I was the operational director. My strategy director was in one office on one side of me. And funnily enough, my finance director was wonderful interpersonally. And so between us, we had the 3 domains covered. So he found that he didn't need to become a strategist. He needed to make sure that strategy was still strong, but through the vehicle of putting a great strategist in the next office. And on big strategic issues, he largely deferring to the strategist. But Peter's mantra was deliver, 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 and he made sure that the operation was strong, that the execution of that strategy was meticulous. Now, I've told this and other stories. If anyone wants to know any more about this, you can always pick up a copy from the library of the book that I've written about it. It's in 3 editions. That they go left to right. The 3rd edition is on the right. I mention it not to flog books, so I'm happy for you to get them out of the library, but simply to tell you that all of this is written up in much more detail because we don't have much time this morning. But I want to leave with you, before we get a chance to talk about these ideas through the vehicle of your questions, 2 audit tools which are not in this book. The first is simply this. I've said on the left, these are the tasks that leaders have to do, or to make sure happen. They have to set strategic direction, create alignment, coordinate the leadership, which I called leading, plan and organize, build and sustain relationships, facilitate team working, deliver results, and incidentally, of course, cope with pressure, because many people find that they can do all of this provided the pressure doesn't get too great, but it all falls to bits when the pressure mounts. So you've got to learn how, as leaders, to make sure that those 8 tasks on the left get done. So the tool I would offer you is simply this, and feel free, that the slides are going to be available to you. You can duplicate this and use it to your heart's content. I want you to ask simply 2 questions and then ask who. So the first question is, how do we currently do this? So how do we set direction? How do we create alignment? And that will allow you the first audit, which is to say, I wonder if we could think of doing this in alternative ways, because the test of that is the second question: how well do we do this? So if you're saying, how do we create alignment? Well, basically I'm the boss and I tell people what to do. Give yourself a 1 for that. That's not creating alignment at all. That's trying to create compliance. Alignment is about the enthusiastic buy-in to ideas, and all of you will be much more sophisticated than that. But how do we do it, and how well do we do it? And then beginning the next bit, who is leading at the time when we're doing this thing? And if you find that the same person is leading all the way down, you might want to wonder whether that's the best way forward. In fact, what you might want to do is use the second audit tool. I've made up here an alphabetical hypothetical team of a number of people, from Alison to Helen. And if you try to think about which of those 3 domains, the strategic, the operational, the interpersonal, do they show the greatest affinity for? Incidentally, you might all want to know that amongst those three domains, usually there's a kind of home domain that people absolutely feel that that's where they live. They do their best work there. They're known for that kind of contribution. There's a second one that they visit frequently, and they're not a stranger to that area. But the third area, and for each of you, it'll be a different third area. For the third area, it may feel that you're a bit more of a stranger in that area, and people don't recognize you there. And if you look back to that Venn diagram, you'll see that within each of those domains, there are 4 leadership tasks. You might say, I wonder which Alison's best leadership tasks are. She seems much more suited to the operation than she does to the interpersonal or the strategic domain. And I reckon she's best at planning and organizing and delivering results. And which is her worst area? Well, as I get to know her and maybe put her through different assessment techniques, or maybe take her through annual appraisals, once I've done a couple of those, I should have a fair understanding of what her best and her worst leadership tasks are. So let me just go back to the first. Wouldn't it be interesting to compare that who leads column with this analysis, which tells me in a sense how best to deploy my team members? And if you put yourself in that list as well, you might well find that there are members of your team who are more capable in some of these leadership tasks on the left than you are. For me, it's dead easy. I'm really no good at planning and organizing. I tried for 20 years to get better at it. And if I got any better at it, I could probably call myself poor. That's about as good as it got. And why was that? It wasn't that I didn't try. It's that my curiosity, my level of conscientiousness, my openness to new stimulation, my curiosity basically, became a massive distraction, and my plans always ended up with holes in them. I'm not bad at building relationships. I'm not bad at setting strategic direction. But planning and organizing is by far and away my worst suit. So what I would do, just like Peter Erskine put a good strategist around him, what I would do is put a good planner around me. And so my executive assistant would always be the one who was skilled at planning and organizing and delivering results. So in a sense, Alison could have been my executive assistant, or any member of my team that I was willing to defer to, particularly in the area of planning and organizing. So just to go back to the 4 propositions I made as a way of a summary, I want to suggest to you first of all, that this model, this simple model, describes the territory of leadership. It tells you the tasks that leaders have to make sure happen. They don't have to do them themselves necessarily, but they need to facilitate these tasks happening, plus coping with pressure. The second proposition is it's really hard to be good at all of it on your own. The third proposition is that you have to choose carefully what to develop. If you spend your time trying to get good in the area of your resistant limitations, which start off really quite poor, the best you might hope for is that you'll get moderately good at it, and it'll take a long period of painful learning to get there. I suggest to you that's not the best use of your time. Develop your potential strengths, the things that you can get good at quickly. That'll be high yield development activity. Keep your fragile strengths strong by keeping those under development, and make your natural strengths into world-class assets. And therefore, the fourth proposition kicks in, which is to work with complementary differences, which simply means putting around you people whose natural strengths are in your areas where you are poorest and least likely to do well. And also least likely, of course, to learn quickly. Now, those are my 4 propositions. And I think I've obeyed my instructions, which is to give plenty of time for questions and comments. So I'll invite you to contribute your questions and comments, and I believe Tracy's going to feed them through to me.
Yeah, thank you, David. That was fascinating. I've had my pen and my piece of paper out again, writing down some of those thoughts. We've had a couple of questions in already, and some comments saying, this is a fantastic, subject, very interesting subject area. So thank you for that. If anyone else has got some questions, please do feed them through now. But I'll start with the couple that we've got already. I know you mentioned your book in there. This person is saying that, you know, it's a fantastic, fascinating subject area. Are there any books you'd recommend for someone beginning their journey? And I've already sent an email asking one of my team to order me the 3rd edition of your book.
Thank you. I'll be able to buy the children some shoes. That's great. That's good. Well, the truth, I was saying to you just before this broadcast started, you remember, Tracy, that I've just written a blog about leadership books. There are 3 kinds, really. I called them friendship bracelets, necklaces, and crowns. The first kind, the friendship bracelet, is someone who's good at leadership telling you what they think is important for you to know. Now, that may or may not be helpful to you. You'll find some who, a bit like theatre critics or film critics, you'll find that they agree with a lot of what you think, and therefore you can read them quite easily, and they're a good guide to what you might want to get involved with. But the problem with the friendship bracelet books is that there isn't much evidence quoted. It's people telling anecdotal stories about their own experience, which I'm not wanting to denigrate. It's their experience and it's real for them. But the thing we don't know is how generalizable it is. Then there are books on leadership, which I call necklaces. A necklace is a series of very precious jewels, but very loosely strung together. And the necklace books, there's a fantastic one called Leadership Jazz. The reason I read it is that I'm writing a book called Leadership Jazz personally, and it's going to be different from this one. But this is from a guy called Max Dupree, who was the chief exec of Herman Miller in the States, a furniture manufacturer. And it's a book which is really revered. It reads like, so the New York Times said it read a bit like scripture. In the sense that it was full of wisdom. But the thing that I found about reading that book is, although it's beautifully written, it's honestly authentic to the man who led in exactly that way himself. And it was incredibly helpful in that sense. It's full of gems. But as I try to string all the gems together, I find I can't do it. They're not well integrated. And then there are the things that I've called crowns. And the crowns are the books that have got a takeaway overall kind of model at the heart of it, which makes the whole thing more portable. Now, unashamedly, I've tried to make my book a crown type book. Lots of evidence in it, but there's a simple framework which I've shown you this morning, which makes the whole thing portable and memorable. Now, the other thing I'd say is that my book, what I've tried to do is to write it for different audiences. So all I say is read the introduction, it's only a few pages, and it'll tell you which chapters are most relevant to you, and you can read those. So what I would say is, if you want to read some straightforward, simple, non-evidence heavy books, you could read Max Dupree's Leadership Jazz. You could read an old book, but a wonderful book called Leaders, The Strategies for Taking Charge by Bennis and Nanus. Now, this was written, 40 years ago, but it's an absolute gem. Or you could have a look at mine and see the chapters that are most useful to you. What I typically do with my book is to say, if you're new to leadership, read the introduction, then read chapters 3, 4, 5, and 10. You know, that becomes the introduction. And then if you want to dig into more things, there's more evidence for you to look at there.
Fantastic, thank you. Because we had a couple of questions around good books, so that should help with 3 or 4 of the questions that have come in. Okay, let me read this question to you. You state that leadership theories lacked principle and foundation and is subject to facts and fashion. Is it not the case that leadership evolves to reflect the societal changes that occur outside the organisation and its teams?
That's exactly my point. Yes, in fact, I think I may have said something like that in the presentation, that what I found was that as I was reading particularly the literature for the 20th century, that early in the 20th century, you've got a very authoritarian era, which if you remember in the middle of the 20th century, the 50s and 60s, there was an awful lot of kicking over of the traces. There was the Prague Spring, there was Haight-Ashbury in the hippies in America. There was all sorts of protest movements throughout Europe and other parts of the OECD countries. And so, not surprisingly, the mores of the time determined the kind of leadership that was favoured at the time. And incidentally, also, it's only in the 60s that the word vision starts to appear. It's interesting, isn't it? We think of vision as being fundamental to leadership. It's not that old, actually, as an idea, apart from one passing reference in the Old Testament of the Bible. But vision in the leadership literature is most likely to be found in the 60s most likely to be discovered rather in the 60s. And then as you get to the latter part of the 20th century, you've got much more democratized, partnership-based, shared models of leadership. So your questioner is dead right. They've observed beautifully what I observed in reading the literature through the 20th century, that leadership simply is a subset of the mores of the time. But what I'm suggesting now is that the mores of the 21st century calls for a much more involving, much more multifactorial approach to leadership, in which the world is moving so fast and in such unpredictable ways that the thought of any one person having a monopoly on wisdom is ridiculous. And so what we've got to do is to create approaches to leadership which invite people to contribute not only their ideas, but also their observations, the things that they think we should be looking at and taking into account. And so that's what I've tried to do in the primary colours approach.
And, you know, I agree with that wholeheartedly. We've done some great work here at Suez around our Jigsaw transformation programme, which is really engaging our people to help us find the solutions to issues. And clearly that helps then, you know, with, you know, transition into any change that you want to transition to, because, you know, people own what they've created and are very keen to deliver what they've created. And I think sometimes in a world that is rapidly changing, people try and skip that very vital part at the beginning that is about actually engaging, including their people in the development of solutions for their business, you know, and miss out on so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no doubt that if you're trying to do that, then once you buy the idea that I really need other people's contributions and that without them I'm unlikely to do well, then you begin to realize that there's a real level of maturity needed from most leaders. You know, maturity goes through 4 stages. Infants are dependent on their parents. They kind of have to do what their parents tell them, because if they don't, they lead into trouble. You know, they get their hands burned, they get run over, whatever it may be. So dependency is the first stage of maturity. As you get to teenage, you go through what's called counter-dependency, or if you like, rebellion. Teenagers do that. They're trying to find the limits to the things that they've erstwhile complied to, but they're pushing against the boundaries to figure out what those limits really are. The third stage of maturity is independence. And some of us going to university have loved the exploration of our own independence. Right. But the fourth stage is what's called mutual, or if you like, interdependency, in which it's okay for you to depend on me and for me to depend on you. And we're both quite comfortable with that, provided our contributions are complementary. So it's also the case, however, that as people go through lives, they don't necessarily move through all 4 stages of maturity. Some people get stuck, some at the dependency stage, some at counter-dependency or rebellion. Many people get stuck at the independence stage. And what I'm urging people to do in the approach to leadership that I've put together is to continue that maturation towards mutual or interdependency, that we're okay depending on each other. So in a sense, what I've done is I've substituted one problem, which is how do I get to be good at all of it, which I'm saying you can't. I'm substituting another problem. Although it feels liberating to be told you don't have to be good at all of it, or you're unlikely to be able to be good at all of it, it's then a puzzle. How do I therefore work with people who are really not like me? That's the puzzle. But I've got to willingly submit to that.
Okay. Plenty more questions. Another one here. As a leader, I was always asked to never use the words like worst and to use phrases like development areas. Has this been turned on its head?
Well, I think in the L&D area, we're guilty of creating all kinds of what I would call trivial orthodoxies. You know, well, you mustn't say this or you mustn't say that. Now, there are some times that they're against the law and you get things you can't say. That's fair enough. That's not trivial. That's significant. But the key issue here is, do you feel respected by your boss? If you respect me, you can tell me what you think I'm best at and what you think I'm worst at. And the fact that you respect me, if that's absolutely transparent to me, I won't bridle at those words. I know that my worst area is planning and organizing. It's worst by a significant margin. It's not even fairly good. It's quite poor. I'm okay with that because I'm good at some other things and I can happily tell you what they are. But the key to this is personal maturity, that I can own and admit both my strengths and my limitations. Therefore, it makes logical sense that I'm going to be better at some things and worse at others, best at probably one and worst at another. All of these are just simple logical consequences of adopting that I'm not equally good at everything. So I am not hung up by those words. I do think about development areas. I do talk about limitations, but occasionally if I say best worst, you will first of all make the judgment, do I respect you? Do I care about you and your development? If the answer to both of those questions is yes, you won't bridle at those words.
And I think, you know, sometimes, you know, we try to sugarcoat things rather than actually being open and honest with someone. And I actually feel that that in many ways is unethical and unfair on those individuals not to, you know, have a conversation that's balanced about the positives and, you know, the areas, as you call that, are the worst. Yeah. Because otherwise, you know, how do they know what they are or aren't doing well, or what they do or don't need to work on? But I know that's not perhaps the approach of everyone. Just
but interestingly, best and worst are actually rather neutral words, because it may be that you've got an extraordinarily able individual, and the thing that they're worst at, they're still better at than a whole bunch of other people. Yeah. So we do well to just remember that the key question here is, do I feel respected by my boss? Incidentally, there is great evidence. I cite lots of this stuff, but there's great evidence that shows if you are respected by your boss, it has all sorts of positive consequences at work. But may I also say, it even has positive consequences for your health and well-being.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it costs nothing. It costs nothing for us to respect people.
Just a question around the audit tool. Just asking, do you do this as a team? And if so, how do you ensure that everyone is willing to give their honest view on themselves and you as their manager, you know, with regards to, you know, who has those sort of natural strengths and who doesn't?
Yeah. Well, what I would do is I'd first of all encourage you just to use it on your own, about yourself and your team. Just start there. Don't share it with anybody. Just sort of use it as a way of provoking your thinking about these areas, and then show it to the team. Not your conclusions, but the questions, the empty, uncompleted form, and let them start to just fill out their own line. And then you can try and get people in a supportive environment to try and declare their conclusions to their colleagues. And what will happen is, particularly if it's followed a 360 or something of that kind, which you can easily do, people will start then just gently to challenge each other. You know, or they'll use different language. They'll say things like, "Oh, you know, Tracy, I'm surprised that you put that as your best area. I thought your best area was this one here." You know, which by implication also means that maybe you're not quite as good at the thing you've declared as being your best area as you think you are. So the idea is to have a team leader facilitate a supportive and challenging, it needs to be both, discussion about these things, particularly if you then start with the idea, we need to be complete together. So we've got to make sure we've got all the bases covered. The other way of doing it, of course, is to put up, if I just go back to my primary colors model, the model on the left, you could just say, let's just think about what each of those things means. Can we put our names? Let's just write our names. If we put it up on a board, let me just put our names against the ones we think we do best. And what you'll find is that there are holes where no one's put their name. Ah, that's interesting. So let's put our second best up there. Where would we put our second best? You know, so we start to do this, and you start to realize that maybe a team really does have a significant development need. And the way of meeting that need is in the short term to try and get someone to step into that area with all sorts of support. But if they haven't got anyone who's very good in that area, maybe we should beg, borrow, or steal someone from another team to try and make my team more complete.
Okay. I'm conscious of the time, but I hope you're all right for a few minutes. So we don't normally like to go over time, but I've got quite a few questions, and an interesting one here that's sort of very relevant to our times, which is how do you see leadership skills evolving to cope with hybrid and remote working?
Well, this is where I'm going to be very outspoken and very provocative. Those are always the tasks of leadership. They always have been, and they always will be. Now, why do I say that? Because how we discharge those tasks, how we execute them, will change with the times. There was a time in those authoritarian days of the early 20th century when creating alignment was simply a matter of issuing an instruction from the top. Everyone said, certainly, and I got on with it. Now, we've got to get people involved in order to create alignment. So what I want to suggest is that there's a world of difference between what and how. So I believe that those tasks are the what of leadership. How is likely to change. But I think that it's important that we don't see everything changing. The only thing that is going to change, however, is the context in which we work. And there's a superb study that's been done by a consultancy in America called Citrix, who looked at the future of artificial intelligence, robotics, and so on. What's it going to do to work? Is it going to enhance workers, or is it going to replace them? And what about the nature of organizations? Are they going to be located and centralized, or as you move forward into the future, are they simply going to become platforms which independent workers can contribute to? And according to how that shakes out and which areas, it may differ between different sectors, but how that shakes out, then the how questions will need to be fundamentally differently answered.
Fantastic. I'm just going to end with the last question. Some of them, apologies, won't be able to get to them all. Hopefully we've sort of covered them in some of the other answers, but this is an interesting one. Are there any good resources on leadership for children and young adults to show them the diversity of skills and show that leadership is not limited to do as you're told?
What an interesting question. I've never been asked that before. And the honest answer is, I don't know. My first thought is, if you look at all sorts of popular media, I'm thinking about movies, TV programs, biographies, autobiographies, you know, there are all sorts of stories about leaders and leadership. And maybe the best way of dealing with this, with children and young people, is to have a discussion about it. So, for example, you know, how is it that an Asperger's suffering 17-year-old Swedish teenager has captured the world's imagination? Greta Thunberg is the most extraordinary phenomenon. She's a quiet, non-dynamic, Asperger's sufferer who has just galvanized the world's leaders to think about climate change. How on earth has that happened? You know, think about Malala Yousafzai. You know, this courageous girl who was attempted to be assassinated by the Taliban. How is it that she has become a champion of girls' education, women's education? You know, there are all sorts of counterintuitive role models of leaders. Those are both young women. And yet mostly you'll read leadership books. The pronoun that's used for leader is he.
Yeah.
So pick up the newspaper. You'll see examples every day. Watch the television, watch the news. Even look at, you know, Hollywood movies. You know, sometimes it's the case that there are perfect provocations to great discussions. And so I'd say get involved if you're a parent or the family member of someone who you think has got great potential. And by the way, particularly with little kids, particularly girls in particular, think about how you describe a stroppy girl versus a stroppy boy. We are guilty still in our society of describing those two things differently. You know, when my 3-year-old granddaughter is stroppy, what I'm trying to do is to say to her parents, yeah, but so when do you think she's going to become Prime Minister?
Yeah. Yeah.
Will it be before or after she wins the Nobel Prize?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We know, you know, we look for different characteristics and behaviours in genders, and you know, it's an area that we all need to, you know, address really, to look at things differently. We've done some stuff actually around that at Suez and around how we can change the way that we look at things. So thank you everybody for some really great questions, and I wonder whether one of those will result in David starting his 11th book around leadership for children and young people, and we will make sure that you get some credit for raising that question, because it's a really fascinating one. So what have we got coming up next week? For next week, we're going to be looking at our social domain in our wellness charter and be having some spring fun with another quiz similar to we held just before Christmas. There'll be £100 worth of shopping vouchers up for the winning team to share. You don't need to join as a team. We'll allocate you to a team on the date next week, and a further £20 voucher for whoever can come up with the best Macmillan Power the Hour idea as part of the work that we're doing with Macmillan this month. We'll have our resident expert quiz compare that with us, Brian Kelly, next week, so that should be some good fun for everybody. But in the meantime, thank you for all your questions. Thank you everyone who joined us, and a big thank you to David, and I'm sure we will be inviting you back to get some further insights in the future.
Terrific. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, David.